Welcome back to the vault. I am the warden. Tonight I have unlocked something that has been sealed away not for lack of interest, but for your protection. The Dunwich Horror by Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Written in 1928, published when the world still believed it stood at the center of something comprehensible. You will understand, when it is finished across 2 transmissions, why certain things are kept in the dark. This is part 1, the origin, the blood, the thing that was raised in secret and fed in silence behind boarded walls, while the hills of Massachusetts shook with a rumbling no geologist could explain. You need to know what the Whateleys were before you can understand what the Whateleys did. You need to understand the boy before you can understand what the boy's death unleashed. Lovecraft did not invent cosmic horror. He excavated it. And in Dunwich, in a hollow in the hills where stone circles crown the summits and whippoorwills call in rhythms that track a dying man's breath, he found something that had been waiting a very long time. If you are new to the vault, subscribe. You will want to be present for part 2. Now, imagine a road in north-central Massachusetts. The wrong fork. The hills closing in. A smell you cannot name. Somewhere in a boarded upper room, the sound of something feeding. Begin. When a traveler in north-central Massachusetts takes the wrong fork at the junction of the Aylesbury Pike just beyond Dean's Corners, he comes upon a lonely and curious country. The ground gets higher, and the briar-bordered stone walls press closer and closer against the ruts of the dusty, curving road. The trees of the frequent forest belt seem too large, and the wild weeds, brambles, and grasses attain a luxuriance not often found in settled regions. At the same time, the planted fields appear singularly few and barren, while the sparsely scattered houses wear a surprising uniform aspect of age, squalor, and dilapidation. Without knowing why, one hesitates to ask directions from the gnarled, solitary figures spied now and then on crumbling doorsteps or in the sloping, rock-strewn meadows. Those figures are so silent and furtive that one feels somehow confronted by forbidden things with which it would be better to have nothing to do. When a rise in the road brings the mountains in view above the deep woods, the feeling of strange uneasiness is increased. The summits are too rounded and symmetrical to give a sense of comfort and naturalness, and sometimes the sky silhouettes with especial clearness the queer circles of tall stone pillars with which most of them are crowned. Gorges and ravines of problematical depth intersect the way, and the crude wooden bridges always seem of dubious safety. When the road dips again, there are stretches of marshland that one instinctively dislikes, and indeed almost fears at evening, when unseen whippoorwills chatter and the fireflies come out in abnormal profusion to dance to the raucous, creepily insistent rhythms of stridently piping bullfrogs. The thin, shining line of the Miskatonic's upper reaches has an oddly serpent-like suggestion as it winds close to the feet of the domed hills among which it rises. It is always a relief to get clear of the place. Afterward, one sometimes learns that one has been through Dunwich. Outsiders visit Dunwich as seldom as possible. And since a certain season of horror, all the signboards pointing toward it have been taken down. 2 centuries ago, when talk of witch blood, Satan worship, and strange forest presences was not laughed at, it was the custom to give reasons for avoiding the locality. In our sensible age, since the Dunwich Horror of 1928 was hushed up by those who had the town's and the world's welfare at heart, people shun it without knowing exactly why. The natives are now repellently decadent, having gone far along that path of retrogression so common in many New England backwaters. Their annals reek of half-hidden murders, incests, and deeds of almost unnameable violence and perversity. The old legends speak of unhallowed rites and conclaves amidst which forbidden shapes of shadow were called out of the great rounded hills, and wild orgiastic prayers were answered by loud crackings and rumblings from the ground below. In 1747, the Reverend Abijah Hoadley preached a memorable sermon on the close presence of Satan and his imps, speaking of the cursed voices of Azazel and Buzzrael, of Beelzebub and Belial, being heard from under the ground by more than a score of credible witnesses then living. He described a very plain discourse of evil powers in the hill behind his own house, a rattling and rolling, groaning, screeching and hissing, such as no things of this earth could raise up. Mr. Hoadley disappeared soon after delivering this sermon. The noises in the hills continued to be reported from year to year, and still form a puzzle to geologists and physiographers. Other traditions tell of foul odors near the hill-crowning circles of stone pillars, and of rushing, airy presences to be heard faintly at certain hours from stated points at the bottom of the great ravines, while still others try to explain the Devil's Hop Yard, a bleak, blasted hillside where no tree, shrub, or grass blade will grow. And then, too, the natives are mortally afraid of the numerous whippoorwills which grow vocal on warm nights. It is vowed that the birds are psychopomps lying in wait for the souls of the dying, and that they time their eerie cries in unison with the sufferer's struggling breath. If they can catch the fleeing soul when it leaves the body, they instantly flutter away, chittering in demoniac laughter. But if they fail, they subside gradually into a disappointed silence. It was in the township of Dunwich, in a large and partly inhabited farmhouse set against a hillside 4 miles from the village and 1.5 miles from any other dwelling, that Wilbur Whateley was born at 5 a.m. on Sunday, the 2nd of February, 1913. Curious, this date was recalled because it was Candlemas, which people in Dunwich curiously observe under another name, and because the noises in the hills had sounded, and all the dogs of the countryside had barked persistently throughout the night before. The mother was one of the decadent Whateleys, a somewhat deformed, unattractive albino woman of 35, living with an aged and half-insane father, about whom the most frightful tales of wizardry had been whispered in his youth. Whispers, Lavinia Whateley had no known husband. She seemed strangely proud of the dark, goatish-looking infant who formed such a contrast to her own sickly albinism, and was heard to mutter many curious prophecies about its unusual powers and tremendous future. Lavinia was one who would be apt to mutter such things, for she was a lone creature given to wandering amidst thunderstorms in the hills, and trying to read the great, odorous books which her father had inherited through 2 centuries of Whateleys. The remote farmhouse had always been feared because of old Whateley's reputation for black magic, and the unexplained death by violence of Mrs. Whateley, when Lavinia was 12 years old, had not helped to make the place popular. There was a hideous screaming which echoed above even the hill noises and the dogs barking on the night Wilbur was born, but no known doctor or midwife presided at his coming. Old Whateley drove his sleigh through the snow into Dunwich village a week later and discoursed incoherently to the loungers at Osborne's store, saying of the child's paternity, "Someday you folks'll hear a child of Lavinia's a-callin' its father's name on the top of Sentinel Hill." Wilbur's growth was indeed phenomenal. Within 3 months of his birth, he had attained a size and muscular power not usually found in infants under a full year of age. Curious, his motions and even his vocal sounds showed a restraint and deliberateness highly peculiar in an infant, and no one was really unprepared when, at 7 months, he began to walk unassisted. The following January, at 11 months, he commenced to talk, with a freedom from infantile lisping of which many children of 3 or 4 might well be proud. His facial aspect was remarkable for its maturity. His large, dark, almost Latin eyes gave him an air of quasi-adulthood and well-nigh preternatural intelligence. Size. He was, however, exceedingly ugly, there being something almost goatish or animalistic about his thick lips, large pored yellowish skin, coarse crinkly hair, and oddly elongated ears. Dogs abhorred the boy from the beginning, and he was always obliged to take various defensive measures against their barking menace. Meanwhile, old Whateley continued to buy cattle without measurably increasing the size of his herd. He also cut timber and began to repair the unused parts of his house, boarding up all the windows in the reclaimed upper section, fitting it with a stout fresh lock. Along the tall, firm shelving, he began gradually to arrange in apparently careful order all the rotting ancient books and parts of books which during his own day had been heaped promiscuously in odd corners of the various rooms. Curious. The boys fittin' to make better use of 'em, the old man would say. Those who called sometimes heard odd cries and footsteps resounding in the boarded-up second story when all the family were below, surprised. A fish peddler who once tried the locked door told the store loungers that he thought he heard a horse stamping on that upper floor. The loungers shuddered as they recalled tales of old Whateley's youth and of the strange things that are called out of the earth when a bullock is sacrificed at the proper time to certain heathen gods. Wilbur was growing up uncannily, reading avidly, talking less and less. A settled taciturnity absorbed him, and for the first time people began to speak specifically of the dawning look of evil in his goatish face. Curious, he would sometimes mutter an unfamiliar jargon and chant in bizarre rhythms which chilled the listener with a sense of unexplainable terror. The aversion displayed toward him by dogs had now become a matter of wide remark, and he was obliged to carry a pistol in order to traverse the countryside in safety. By the time he was 4.5 years old, he looked like a lad of 15, his lip and cheek fuzzy with a coarse dark down, size, and the stench that trickled down from the sealed upper story of the farmhouse had begun to attract the attention of reporters from Boston and Arkham alike, who printed flamboyant Sunday stories of young Wilbur's precociousness, old Whateley's black magic, the shelves of strange books, and the weirdness of the whole region and its hill noises. For a decade after this public attention, the annals of the Whateleys sink indistinguishably into the general life of a morbid community hardened to their ways. Twice a year they would light fires on the top of Sentinel Hill, at which times the mountain rumblings recurred with greater and greater violence, while at all seasons there were strange and portentous doings at the lonely farmhouse. Curious callers professed to hear sounds in the sealed upper story, even when all the family were downstairs, and they wondered how swiftly or how lingeringly a cow or bullock was usually sacrificed. About 1923, when Wilbur was a bearded 10-year-old whose mind, voice, stature, and bearded face gave all the impressions of maturity, a second great siege of carpentry went on at the old house, all inside the sealed upper part. From bits of discarded lumber, people concluded that the youth and his grandfather had knocked out all the partitions and even removed the attic floor, leaving only one vast open void between the ground story and the peaked roof. In the spring after this renovation, old Whateley noticed the growing number of whippoorwills that came out of Cold Spring Glen to chirp under his window at night. He seemed to regard the circumstance as one of great significance. "They whistle just in tune with my breathing now," he told the loungers at Osborne's, "and I guess they're getting ready to catch my soul. They know it's a-going out and don't calculate to miss it." On Lammas night of 1924, Dr. Houghton of Aylesbury arrived to find the old man in a very grave state. The shapeless albino daughter and the oddly bearded grandson stood by the bedside, whilst from the vacant abyss overhead there came a disquieting suggestion of rhythmical surging or lapping, as of the waves on some level beach. Outside, a seemingly limitless legion of whippoorwills cried their endless message in repetitions timed diabolically to the wheezing gasps of the dying man. Toward 1 o'clock, old Whateley gained consciousness long enough to choke out his last words to his grandson. "More space, Willie. More space soon. You grows, and that grows faster. It'll be ready to sarve ye soon, boy." open up the gates to Yog-Sothoth with the long chant that you'll find on page 751 of the complete edition, and then put a match to the prison. Fire from Aerith can't burn it nohow. Feed it regular, Willie, and mind the quantity, but don't let it grow too fast for the place. For if it busts quarters or gets out afore ye opens to Yog-Sothoth, it's all over and no use. Only them from beyond can make it multiply and work. Only them, the old uns as wants to come back. Speech gave place to gasps. The final throaty rattle came. Lavinia sobbed, but Wilbur only chuckled, whilst the hill noises rumbled faintly. "They didn't get him," he muttered in his heavy bass voice. Wilbur was by this time a scholar of really tremendous erudition, quietly known by correspondence to many librarians in distant places where rare and forbidden books of old days are kept. He was more and more hated and dreaded around Dunwich because of certain youthful disappearances which suspicion laid vaguely at his door. His height, having reached the normal adult limit, seemed inclined to wax beyond that figure. In 1926, his mother, the twisted albino Lavinia, vanished on Halloween after a pandemoniac cachinnation of unnaturally assembled whippoorwills filled all the countryside around the unlighted Whateley farmhouse. She was never seen again. By 1927, Wilbur stood more than 7 feet tall, had closed all the ground floor doors and windows of the farmhouse, removed its inner partitions as he had once done to the upper story, and was living in one of the outsheds. Something requiring the entire interior of the house was growing inside. The following winter brought Wilbur's first trip outside the Dunwich region. Correspondence with the Widener Library at Harvard, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the British Museum, the University of Buenos Aires, and the Library of Miskatonic University at Arkham had all failed to procure him the loan of a book he desperately wanted. So at length he set out in person, shabby, dirty, bearded, and uncouth of dialect, almost 8 feet tall, carrying a cheap new valise, to consult the copy at Miskatonic, which was nearest him geographically. This dark and goatish gargoyle appeared one day in Arkham in quest of the dreaded volume kept under lock and key at the college library. The hideous Necronomicon of the mad Arab Alhazred, in Olaus Wormius's Latin version, as printed in Spain in the 17th century. He was looking, he admitted to the librarian, the erudite Henry Armitage, for a formula or incantation containing the frightful name Yog-Sothoth. As Wilbur copied the passage he finally chose, Dr. Armitage looked involuntarily over his shoulder at the open pages. The text ran, "The old ones were, the old ones are, and the old ones shall be. Not in the spaces we know, but between them. They walk serene and primal, undimensioned, and to us unseen. Yog-Sothoth knows the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the gate. Yog-Sothoth is the key and guardian of the gate. Past, present, future, all are one in Yog-Sothoth. He knows where the old ones broke through of old, and where they shall break through again. By their smell can men sometimes know them near. As a foulness shall ye know them. Their hand is at your throats, yet ye see them not. They wait, patient and potent, for here shall they reign again." Dr. Armitage felt a wave of fright, as tangible as a draught of the tomb's cold clamminess. The bent, goatish giant before him seemed like the spawn of another planet or dimension, something only partly of mankind, linked to black gulfs of essence and entity that stretch like titan phantasms beyond all spheres of force and matter, space and time. When Wilbur was refused the loan of the volume, He strode out of the building without another word, stooping at each doorway. Armitage locked away the Necronomicon with a shudder, but the room still reeked with an unholy and unidentifiable stench. "As a foulness shall ye know them," he quoted aloud to the empty room. In the weeks that followed, he set about collecting every possible datum on Wilbur Whateley and the formless presences around Dunwich. And what he learned drove him, slowly, through varied degrees of alarm, to a state of really acute spiritual fear. Early in August of 1928, in the small hours of the 3rd, Dr. Armitage was awakened suddenly by the wild, fierce cries of the savage watchdog on the college campus. Deep and terrible, the snarling, half-mad growls and barks continued, always in mounting volume, but with hideously significant pauses. Then there rang out a scream from a wholly different throat, such a scream as roused half the sleepers of Arkham and haunted their dreams ever afterward. Such a scream as could come from no being born of earth or wholly of earth. Armitage rushed to the college buildings. An open window showed black and gaping in the moonlight. The burglar alarm was still shrilling from the library. Something had come in. The building was full of a frightful stench, which Dr. Armitage knew too well. He and 2 colleagues rushed to the small genealogical reading room. For a second, nobody dared to turn on the light. Then Armitage summoned up his courage and snapped the switch. One of the 3 shrieked aloud at what sprawled before them, among the disordered tables and overturned chairs. The thing that lay half-bent on its side in a fetid pool of greenish-yellow ichor was almost 9 feet tall. Surprised, the dog had torn off all the clothing and some of the skin. It was not quite dead, but twitched silently and spasmodically while its chest heaved in monstrous unison with the mad piping of the expectant whippoorwills outside. It was partly human, beyond a doubt, with very man-like hands and head, the goatish, chinless face bearing the stamp of the Whateleys upon it. But the torso and lower parts were teratologically fabulous, so that only generous clothing could ever have enabled it to walk on earth unchallenged. Size. Above the waist it was semi-anthropomorphic, with a chest bearing the leathery reticulated hide of a crocodile or alligator. Below the waist all human resemblance ceased. The skin was thickly covered with coarse black fur, and from the abdomen a score of long, greenish-gray tentacles with red, sucking mouths protruded limply, their arrangement following the symmetries of some cosmic geometry unknown to Earth or the solar system. Of genuine blood there was none, only the fetid greenish-yellow ichor which trickled along the painted floor and left a curious discoloration behind it. It began to mumble without turning or raising its head. Curious. Nothing in English was uttered. At first the syllables defied all correlation with any speech of Earth, but toward the last there came some disjointed fragments from the Necronomicon, that monstrous blasphemy in quest of which the thing had perished. Those fragments, as Armitage recalls them, ran something like Ngai, Nagaga, Bug-Shogog, Yaha, Yog-Sothoth, Yog-Sothoth. They trailed off into nothingness as the whippoorwills shrieked in rhythmical crescendos of unholy anticipation. Gasps. Then came a halt in the gasping. Outside the window, the shrilling of the whippoorwills suddenly ceased, and vast clouds of feathery watchers rose and raced from sight, frantic at that which they had sought for prey. When the medical examiner came, there was only a sticky whitish mass on the painted boards. Apparently Whateley had had no skull or bony skeleton in any true or stable sense. Whispers he had taken somewhat after his unknown father. The door is not yet closed, only half open. Wilbur Whateley is gone, dissolved into a residue that defied identification and offended every trained instinct in the room. But what Wilbur Whateley had been feeding, what had been growing in the upper story of that farmhouse while the cattle went missing and the hills shook, that is still very much present. It has been without food since August 2nd. It has been growing for 15 years, and no one has opened the farmhouse to check on it. Not yet. Part 2 of this transmission has already been selected. The door has been found. The question that remains is not whether it will open. The question is whether anything human will be left to close it again. Subscribe to the vault. Return when you are ready. Until then, stay in the dark.